One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able...
Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of News 2 as we recognize Dr. Martin Luther King. His courageous and selfless devotion gave direction to 13 years of civil rights activities. His words, action, and commitment have inspired many to this day. How did it all begin for Dr. Martin Luther King? Here's more on the life of a great leader. He was the son of a preacher man born on January 15, 1929 at the family home in Atlanta, Georgia. Martin Luther King Jr. was the first son and the second child born to the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. He attended elementary and high schools in Atlanta. Because of his high scores on college entrance examinations during his junior year in high school, he advanced to Morehouse College without formal graduation from Booker T. Washington High School. Having skipped both the 9th and 12th grades, Dr. King entered college at the age of 15. In 1948, he graduated from Morehouse with a BA degree in sociology. He enrolled in Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, and the University of Pennsylvania, receiving numerous awards. Martin Luther King followed in his father's footsteps and entered the Christian ministry. He was ordained in 1948 at the age of 19 at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. King married Coretta Scott in 1953, and 4 children soon became part of the family. By this time, King was already a strong worker for civil rights for members of his race. He was a member of the NAACP, the National Advancement of Colored People. In 1955, a nonviolent black protest, which lasted 382 days, gained much attention. Civil rights activist Rosa Parks refused to comply with Montgomery's segregation policy on buses. King gained national prominence for his role as president of the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association. On December 21, 1956, after the Supreme Court had declared unconstitutional the laws requiring segregation on buses, blacks and whites rode the bus as equals. During these days of boycott, King was arrested. His home was bombed. He was subjected to personal abuse, but at the same time emerged as a leader. King also experienced resistance from national political leaders' efforts to undermine. He spoke at many different places, often appearing where there was injustice, protest, and action. In 1960, black college students initiated a wave of sit-in protests that led to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. King wholeheartedly supported the movement. In 1963, clashes between unarmed black demonstrators and police armed with dogs and fire hoses generated media headlines throughout the world. President Kennedy responded to the protests by submitting civil rights legislation to Congress, which led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Subsequent mass demonstrations culminated in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28, 1963, in which more than 250,000 protesters gathered in Washington, D.C. It was on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. King became Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1963 and recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. King's leadership was intensified during 1967 as urban racial violence escalated, and he publicly criticized U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War, which led to strained relations with Lyndon Johnson's administration. King also faced criticism from other movements, including the Black Power. Martin Luther King pushed forward nevertheless. On the evening of April 4, 1968, while standing on the balcony of his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was to lead a protest march in sympathy with striking garbage workers of the city, he was assassinated. Many were shocked. His funeral services were held April 9, 1968 in Atlanta at Ebenezer Church and on the campus of Morehouse College, with the President of the United States declaring a day of mournings and flags being flown at half-staff. James Earl Ray was arrested in London to stand trial for the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. He was sentenced to 99 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 39 years old at the time of his passing. Meanwhile, on St. Thomas, every year the St. Thomas Synagogue puts the spotlight on young Virgin Islanders who have a spark of Martin Luther King's values in them. The synagogue's new rabbi spoke to News 2 about this year's honorees and why they make sure they celebrate Dr. King's birthday every year.
Another batch of Virgin Islands youth were honored for following in the footsteps of Dr. Martin Luther King at the annual special Shabbat Award service of the Hebrew Congregation of St. Thomas. The event, which has drawn top government and community leaders from all over the islands, celebrates the life of Martin Luther King by recognizing students who wrote essays embodying King's values.
What they have written about and who they are embody the principles of Dr. King. Principles like risk-taking, being able to speak about things that might be sensitive issues, politically charged issues, taking leadership roles.
This year, they're honoring Irvin Mason Jr. from All Saints, Jamoy Gerald from Antilles School, Tommy Wise from Charlotte Amalie High School, Vella Culbert from Gift Hill, Sherwin Williams Jr. from Ivana Eudorican High School, J.R. Smith from Seventh-day Adventist, Camille Emmanuel from Saints Peter and Paul, and Khalees Potter from Peter Gruber International Academy. According to Rabbi Harvey, the Jewish community has always felt a close affinity to the Southern Baptist African-American Christian leader.
In many Jewish communities around the world, MLK Weekend is an event that we honor and celebrate. We honor and celebrate these things because Dr. King stood for values that Reform Judaism stands for, civil rights, social justice. So when Dr. King stood up for equal rights and civil rights for African Americans in the United States, the Jews were right there with him.
Harvey was pleased to bring down Rabbi Jonah Pesner, director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, as keynote speaker.
He is the person on the front lines for social justice, for civil rights. He recently reenacted the March to Selma.
According to Rabbi Harvey, he hopes that this year's student honorees would later become catalysts of change in society. Reporting for News 2, I'm April Knight.
The students also received $500 each from the award organizers as part of their prize, in addition to the opportunity to read their essays to dignitaries present at that program. Congratulations to all the recipients. Myron D. Jackson, Senator Myron D. Jackson joins the world in celebrating the anniversary of Martin Luther King's birth. Long before Martin Luther King Day became a national holiday, he says, the Virgin Islands declared a day to honor the memory of the civil rights leader who symbolized faith and freedom. The 15 senators who gathered as a body over 40 years ago passed the legislation in solidarity with the vision that the hope and dream of what he stood for would one day become a reality. All Virgin Islanders, and particularly our youth, may take comfort and gain encouragement from the life of this great apostle of nonviolence who sought through constructive measures justice and liberty for all mankind. According to Bill number 4293, it called to commemorate the holiday and to examine our hearts to determine that we are honoring the dream and fulfilling the vision of brotherhood, justice, and individual liberty that gave true purpose to the life and works of Martin Luther King. Senator Jean Ford urged Virgin Islands residents to unite in a collective effort to reclaim the community from the cycle of poverty and violent crime that has impacted and claimed the lives of so many Virgin Islanders. Dr. Martin Luther King once said that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Noted the Democratic senator, we cannot remain silent about the recent violence that has plagued the territory, and we cannot be silent about the underlying social and economic causes that are largely responsible for the atmosphere of violence and crime. He said, let us not forget those who are in need of assistance, whether it be a person or place, and let us come together as a people to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Day by serving humanity. And here's more from Senator Kenneth Gittens, who also reacted.
He was strong and stood up at times when even the strongest among him chose to remain silent. Dr. King was decades ahead in his thinking as we now enjoy the rights and liberties that he fought for. We have come a long way as a people, even as we celebrate the final State of the Union address by the first ever black president of this country a few days ago. But our struggles are far from over, and we have to do more and be more to exude the real essence of Dr. King's dreams.
How do many remember Dr. Martin Luther King? What kind of message still lives? We asked many of you to share your thoughts. We'll have that later on in the newscast. But right now, here's an excerpt from his most famous speech delivered on August 28, 1963 in Washington. It's called, "I Have a Dream."
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Welcome back on this special Dr. Martin Luther King Remembrance. On St. Croix at the Lumaco Elementary School, Wendy Winter prepared special instructions in her classroom to inform her students of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The class listened to speeches by King and examined the "I Have a Dream" speech, which Martin Luther King Jr. delivered, as we mentioned, August 28, 1963. The students also stood up from their seats and delivered their own speeches based upon King's dreams for America. Stephanie Brown reports for News 2.
The life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Martin Luther King Jr. Day is an American federal holiday marking the birthday of King himself. In commemoration of Martin Luther King Day in the territory, several schools held in-classroom instruction to inform students on the importance of celebrating this national holiday.
Well, it's important for us to always try to bring our textbooks to reality for the students. So that's why I try to incorporate the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the things that he have done for us that the students have read about and bring it in front of them for them to be able to see exactly where he was, the space of mind that he was in at the time that he wrote his speech. As you can see, the students in my classroom, from what they're experiencing in their life today and in our community, they wrote their heartfelt feelings of what their dream is, what do they want for the students of this world, for the people coming after them.
On November 2nd, 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill enacting a federal holiday honoring Dr. King.
In the 50s and 60s, one of the important crises we faced was racial discrimination. The man whose words and deeds in that crisis stirred our nation to the very depths of its soul was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
On April 4th, 1968, King was assassinated as he stood on the balcony of his hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee. His death was a great loss to the country, but it did not derail the civil rights movement from fighting for equality of all African Americans. Stephanie Brown, News 2.
Dr. King has touched lives all around the world with his message of equal rights and peaceful activism, but few are lucky to have actually met him. One Virgin Islander recalls fondly the time when a small community's attempt to stall desegregation in schools led to his personal encounter with Dr. King.
We were in the midst of a 5-year public school closing period. I didn't go to 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. Our school system in Prince Edward County was closed to avoid racial desegregation. Rather than agree with the court order, the county school board, which was all white, voted not to appropriate any money for public schools. They would close them rather than integrate them. So it was in the midst of that school closing, and that we became very active as a community, a black community, and that was the occasion during which I met Dr. King, and he gave us a very, and we, as we demonstrated, we were being trained in nonviolent, peaceful, nonviolent resistance. We were picketing, we were boycotting the stores of the town until we had our schools, and until the separate but unequal facilities, not just the schools, but everything would be eliminated.
And Dr. King was known for his strong stance on nonviolence that translated into his views on war. In 1967, during an NBC interview on the Mike Douglas Show, he defended his political views.
Well, I think my view has been a little distorted at that point. I haven't only urged Negroes not to fight. I feel that the war is so unjust, so abominable, so futile and bloody and costly that nobody should be fighting there. I haven't limited my concern to just the American Negro, although I know we are dying in disproportionate numbers there, and we are on the losing end both there and at home, because as long as the war in Vietnam continues, social programs will inevitably suffer here at home.
Well, here at home, many events were held in recognition of Dr. Martin Luther King Day. The St. Thomas Association of Roadrunners, they held a Martin Luther King 5K walk. That was on Sunday at Vitraco Park. On St. Croix, the Christian Academy held a march from Claude Walker School to the park. And the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, Theta Epsilon Lambda chapter, they held their annual Martin Luther King March earlier today from 12 noon from the Enid M. Ball Library to Emancipation Garden. Many schools and civic organizations participated. Also today, the Alla Muller School Bambula dancers, they held a march from about 8 a.m. from Muller School to Crown Bay, then Lindbergh Bay Beach, and back to Alla Muller School. St. Croix also had a march as well. Well, a few days before MLK Jr. Day, the Department of Justice held its annual event on Thursday. The DOJ held its annual commemorative program honoring the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Attorney General Loretta Lynch delivered the keynote speech. She says the Department of Justice is still working to ensure every citizen has the right to vote. Lynch says the department is working to reduce recidivism. She says programs distributed $53 million in grants under the Second Chance Act to ensure people who leave the criminal justice system have the ability and right to go home. Protesters gathered outside the annual MLK breakfast because Mayor Rahm Emanuel is hosting a group of protesters frustrated with Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who gathered outside the city's annual Martin Luther King Jr. breakfast. The pastors say up to 60 ministers from throughout the city were not attending the breakfast this year. They say the mayor had a role in covering up the police shooting of Laquan McDonald. Outrage over police shootings have rumbled through Chicago since the November release of the shooting video of McDonald, who was shot 16 times. Emanuel says the breakfast is not about him, but about celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King and his life's work. Here's more.
Good morning. I'm supposed to reflect on Dr. King, and I'm so happy that I was actually doing
the Atlanta Symphony, Cincinnati Symphony, and our own Chicago Symphony Orchestra, among many others.
And there is a lesson here for all of us, and a hard lesson of the hard truths that face this city. Because we will not be the city we need to be and can be unless we restore trust between our police and our communities and provide opportunities for all Chicagoans who see the future of Chicago and their future together.
Dr. King has undoubtedly changed the American social landscape on a massive scale, but for individuals he influenced, the man represented many different things. Here are more personal thoughts on Dr. Martin Luther King.
In my secular studies growing up, middle school and high school, we of course learned about Dr. King. We saw the video of the I Have a Dream speech, and we learned about that through the civil rights movement. That was pretty standard. It's part of standard curriculum. I learned about that. When I pursued the rabbinate, when I became a rabbi, I learned a great deal more about the Jewish community connection to Dr. King.
To me, signifies a lot. I mean, he's one of the very few people who have a significant impact in my life and who I very much look up to. There's Martin Luther King Jr., there's Barack Obama, and there was my father. Very short list. And this represents making a difference in the community, pushing for equal rights for all citizens, not just, you know, blacks, or just for all citizens to be equal. And just making your voice heard without actually necessarily having to be violent to make your point, to get your point across.
Be sure to stick around. Your News 2 AccuWeather forecast is coming up next.